This closing part of the book is about ensuring you can always use fit-for-purpose practices by demonstrably aligning them to your organization's brand. We begin this section by looking at the question of why values programs so often run out of steam, the kind of challenges you need to be wary of. Then we map out a viable alternative approach, and because it's a wee bit technical, I'll bring it to life for you with a worked example, and we close with some thoughts on how you might develop a cultural mandate of your own. So, why do brand values so often end up getting forgotten about in-house? Well, interestingly, despite high-profile, often costly launches, many organizations struggle to embed their brand fully into the way their people work, and its values often end up as just a poster on the wall that most people don't even notice after a while. Indeed, in some organizations, they've given up on the idea of values altogether and are now talking in terms of brand characteristics or attitude, although the results can end up being pretty much the same. So for our purposes, I'll use the term brand values as a form of shorthand for ways of doing things that support the brand. Of course, however well or not your brand is working internally at present, if you've identified with any of these issues, this final part of the book is still going to be relevant to you. After all, employees first learn about the values through internal communications. And are those communications themselves completely congruent with the brand, or could those messages or the way they're being delivered have been undermining themselves from the start? Of course, there are other reasons why brand values don't embed effectively into an organization's culture, but given how pervasive internal communication is, your organization's IC practices must surely be a significant factor. And many organizations attempt to deal with this by introducing style guides. But plenty of these guides wither on the vine, usually within months and often within weeks. And the reasons why this happens give us some clues about how to turn things around and get everybody to work with you in the way you want. Firstly, let's never forget that communicating, including the way we write, is a very personal activity, and many people may quite reasonably resist being told how to do it, particularly if the standards they're being asked to follow include one of the following 4 failings. Number 1. Within many style guides, the reasons for following certain standards and guidelines have been left out, so people don't know why a particular rule or guideline matters and have little incentive to follow it if they don't feel like it. Secondly, even when the reasons are included, those justifications are often based upon subjective opinion or untenable leaps of faith, so the standards themselves and the people who want them followed can lack credibility. Now, many organizations have already taken care of these first 2, but what about the next 2? The third problem is that it's almost always the case that the standards people would need to follow are incomplete. So it's quite possible that people aren't always communicating on brand, not because of the standards you have at the moment, but because of the ones that aren't there. And finally, it's also frequently the case that the people who are supposed to adopt the new practices haven't been given enough smartied support to do so. So even if they want to communicate on brand, they simply don't have what it takes at the moment. Now, you may not recognize all of these, but if you're going to get everybody to let you use your fit-for-purpose practices, we still need to check them off against some simple rules to ensure that none of these challenges can trip you up. So let's start with the fact that some style guides have instructions which claim to support particular values, but give no explanation as to how or why they do so. It means employees are expected to just take the instructions on trust. And more insidious still, it suggests that the people who've put the guidelines together either can't justify their claims or haven't even bothered to try. So immediately there's a credibility issue, which becomes even worse if, say, page 17 of the style guide is written in a way which contradicts the instructions given on page 9. And this happens a lot, even in style guides put together by agencies who specialize in this area. So, even though these may sound obvious, let's just lay out a couple of rules here. To be sustainable, any practice standards you have must be linked to your values in a way everybody can see and understand, and they must all be followed through within the standards themselves. Importantly though, even when people include demonstrable links between the values and the guidelines, those links can still lack credibility. The challenge often lies in the simple fact that although it's possible to hint at values through a particular writing style, you can never do anything more than that. Hint. So claiming that if people write in a particular style, they will be promoting the organisation's values can often look naive. So rule 3. If you really want people to follow your standards, the links to the values need to be made and explained in ways that employees can't reasonably argue with. Now, as I said, you may already have these first 3 rules in place and universally applied. However, even if the style guide meets those first 3 rules, it can still result in communications which undermine your organisation's brand. After all, it's perfectly possible to produce a beautifully designed and beautifully written communication which can end up annoying its audience because, as attractive as it is, it simply wasted their time. Or some of the people who needed the communication haven't received it at all and find out about it only later through the grapevine. And if these audiences are internal, it can undermine their belief in the very concept of brand standards. So clearly, we need to look beyond how things are written and designed and take a more systemic approach, demonstrably aligning not just your style guide, but all your mainstream IC practices to your organization's brand. And finally, as we discovered in the technical mandate section, there's no point introducing new practices and just assuming that everybody who needs to follow them will have all the smarted resources they need to do so. And as obvious as this sounds, these sorts of assumptions again happen a lot. So we need to check with the relevant employees to find out what support they're going to need in order to follow whatever practices we're introducing and provide that support, which of course may have implications for the budget you're going to need. Now, between them, the technical and financial mandate sections of this book have already talked you through the basics of how to handle the question of whether people have what it takes to be on brand with their internal communicating. But what about the first 3 issues? How do you credibly align all your practices with your organization's brand so that everybody you work with knows they need to do so in a particular way, not because you say so, but simply to meet the demands of your organization's values? Well, here at ICM, we've developed a model for doing exactly that. It operates at 4 levels. Starting with your organization's values or brand characteristics, it picks out those which are relevant to a particular aspect of your work and uses them to define specific behavioral needs. It then gathers those needs together to build management policies for each of your practices, such as your approvals process, message calendar, and, of course, your writing style guide. And finally, it articulates the detailed procedures people need to follow in order to fulfill each policy. This gives everybody a clear line of sight between what they're being asked to do and the brand itself. It's simple enough in principle, but at present perhaps a little bit abstract. So in a moment, I'll show you an example of how it works. Before I do so though, we need to be sure that we're not going to fall into that trap of making any of those untenable leaps of faith. For this, we need to dip into the field of behavioral linguistics, which, if you haven't heard the name before, is a collective term for a number of similar and often overlapping fields of study: transformational grammar, NLP, psycholinguistics, and others, which, if you're not familiar with them, are all essentially covering largely the same ground, helping us to understand how different choices of words and phrases can affect not just what we think, but how our thinking works in any given moment. If you are familiar with this concept, please bear with me for a few moments while I explain it for people who haven't come across it before, and for the fact that, for the sake of time, I will inevitably be cutting a few corners in my explanations. One aspect of behavioral linguistics which is particularly relevant to making your brand standards credible affects the way we think about cause and effect. If we're focusing on what we think we'll get out of a particular course of action, this is often referred to as towards thinking. So we'll essentially be saying, if we do X, we will or should get Y. If, on the other hand, we're focusing on what might happen if we don't pursue that course of action, it's often referred to as away from orientation. With that orientation, we'd be thinking along the following lines: if we don't do X, we could end up with Z. And the reason this matters is because it seems most organizations try to establish brand standards by using only towards thinking. So this is where they can often come unstuck. For example, if an organization has a value of caring, they'd be trying to come up with standards which will make customers or employees feel cared about. And there are two problems with this. Firstly, there's an often unspoken assumption that everybody will necessarily infer the same values from the same piece of writing. However, as we've already seen, a piece of writing which one person understands as caring may come across to someone else as condescending. Secondly, there are almost always going to be many more ways of undermining a particular value than there are ways of actively promoting it. To illustrate this, let's just imagine that Johnny Depp has sent an email to his mobile phone provider to ask for some technical help. And let's also imagine that the company has caring as one of its values. If the reply to his email starts "Dear Johnny," is he necessarily going to spontaneously think, "Oh look, they got my name right, what a caring company"? Unlikely, wouldn't you say, because he'd probably be expecting that as a matter of course. So thus far, the phone company has done nothing but meet his expectations. It is, if you like, a minimum hygiene standard. However, if the reply were to spell his name wrong, might he not reasonably think that he was dealing with a careless company? Like it or not then, there are always going to be loads more ways of undermining the brand than there are ways of actively promoting it, and not just with customers but with employees too. So, if your organization's values are going to have any sustainable credibility, you need to ensure that your internal communication practices aren't doing anything to undermine them. So with this in mind, let's now consider how we can use that values model we just looked at to underpin your internal communication practices and get everybody to follow them. Importantly, I'm not going to teach you how to do the job here because that would take way too long, but I do want you to be able to see how it's possible to connect any internal communication practice to your organization's values in a way that no one can reasonably argue with, so you don't have to live with these sorts of issues anymore. For example, let's consider the challenge of people not putting aside enough time to brief you. Whether this is something you currently face or not, this example will show you how the model works. So let's start by giving a name to this challenge. We'll call it briefing time. Now we need to look at some values that could address this. And to bring this to life for you, I thought it would be useful to use a real organization. It needs to be one that everybody knows about, but which can't be compromised in any way by what I share with you. So it needs to be one with no competition and which has its values on public display. So, United Nations seems to fit the bill here, and they have 4 values. Each of them is expressed as a single word, and underneath each they have a series of what they call monitorable behaviors. For example, one of their values is efficient, and one of the monitorable behaviors that tells them they're meeting this value is that they clarify objectives and delegate effectively. And a second value they have is about being responsible, which includes the monitorable behavior of managing their finances transparently and delivering value for money. So, how would we use these 2 monitorable behaviors to address that challenge of people not setting aside enough time to provide a proper brief? Well, if we were to go down the traditional route of using only towards thinking, we'd leap straight from these monitorable behaviors to insisting that people set aside enough time for briefing. And while some people may be able to make that leap, others may not. And if they don't want to play ball, they could argue against it. However, if we use away from thinking, we can pretty much eliminate the need for any such leap, because we're now highlighting the risks of not setting that time aside. The risk of wasting employee time, for example, is indefensible because that time has to be paid for, which means the organization would be wasting money. And the risk of confusing employees' priorities can't be justified because it flies in the face of clarifying objectives and delegating effectively, and both of those risks become realistic possibilities if employees end up receiving communications they either don't need at all or can't understand properly. So it's in order to avoid these demonstrable risks that clients have no choice but to invest the time needed to ensure that the process of developing communications is as efficient as it can be for all those involved, and that their audiences only get communications that are useful to them. So it's that crucial away from thinking step that makes our towards thinking that much more compelling. So what would this mean for you if you wanted to develop a cultural mandate to underpin your right to use fit-for-purpose practices? Well, the important thing to bear in mind here is that if your organization has a set of values or brand characteristics, you already have a mandate to eliminate these issues. And if you're facing any of these and other challenges at present, it may mean you simply haven't articulated the mandate you already have, although it may also be that the practice designs or skills still need developing. But once those designs are robust, you'd simply need to connect them to your organization's values in the way I've just shown you. I say simply, but of course I recognize it's not necessarily easy for two reasons. Firstly, you may not currently have the time to do this work, which is where your financial mandate can help. Secondly, though, I know I've made our values model look pretty simple, which in fact it is, but making it work credibly does rely on a number of specific behavioral linguistic techniques. It's not just about towards and away from. There's a lot more going on here. So how can ICM help you make this happen? Well, in fact, you have a couple of options. We can either come in and do it for you as a piece of consultancy work, or we can teach you and your team to do it for yourselves, and you can find out more about your options here. So whatever issues may have been holding you back, you can now end them all and arrive at that sweet spot and stay there from then on through a credible combination of technical rigor, financial astuteness and cultural congruence, which can make life better not only for you but all the people you work with and the people whose quality of life is directly or indirectly affected by them. And having done it once, you should be able to keep yourself in that sweet spot wherever your career may take you in the future. We'd love to help you make this happen wherever you are in the world, and it all starts with defining your sweet spot. So if you want to start moving ever closer to that sweet spot, it may be appropriate to share this video book with your manager or colleagues, or if you'd like to start robustly defining the mandate you truly want, do drop us a line. I really hope you found this video book useful, and thank you for watching.